Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. I'm Glenn Deason, and I'm joined today by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former State Department Chief of Staff to General Colin Powell. So, welcome. It's not every day I get to speak with such a senior official from the State Department. I really wanted to start by asking you about the inner workings of the US government because, I guess the big news of the recent days and weeks is obviously Trump's efforts to reshape the State Department, if not control it, as well as going after the deep state and the blob. Um, I was wondering if you can explain a bit how it works and to what extent you see the likelihood of Trump achieving his objectives.
I think the issue that has been foremost in people's minds in a very distorted way in some respects here in America for the last few days is U.S. aid and what he's trying to do to U.S. aid. And I've confounded some people, some people who uh, more or less have been drawn to my views in the last several years because they seem to be more realistic than perhaps others. But I said, look, U.S. aid is a shadow of its former self, and its former self is what everyone thinks it is, and so is criticizing Trump's moves. And what do you mean? And then I watched Andrew Natsios on television talking about it, who was our U.S. aid director, whom Powell brought into the meetings that he held every morning that he was in town for the first time in some time, putting aid very close to the Secretary of State. And Andy was of the mind that everything was copacetic under Powell. Well, it wasn't. U.S. aid had been turned into by the Congress of the United States, led by Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who had a vengeance and a vendetta against the State Department. He didn't like foreign policy. He thought it was wasted money. He thought the State Department was a wasted bureau. And he got rid of ACDA, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. We had to incorporate it into state where it went immediately into oblivion virtually. And we had to incorporate USIA into state, into a public to policy code. All to say that USAID turned into essentially a few State Department managers looking after many, many private contractors. They did the job on the ground that USAID in the past was famous for doing. Bureaucrats did it. Bureaucrats didn't compete with one another. Contractors competed with one another, would hide best practices from one another. Because if you were in Helmand province and you were in Kandahar province, you didn't want the people in Helmand to get the contract again next year. You wanted to get it. So you weren't about to share anything with them that was working, and nor they with you. So all to say, USAID has devolved into a Dick Cheney like privatized government agency with only managers over all the contractors. And most of the money, of course, Jesse Helms' intention, flowed back to the United States, not to the development services offered overseas. So my conclusion was good move, Mr. Trump and Mr. Secretary of State Rubio. But I don't know what they're going to do in its place. And what I'm hearing is even more disastrous. They're not even going to have the contractors. So I don't know what USAID is going to be now. And I suspect there are going to be some actions with regard to other activities within state that even I would say and did say as chief of staff to Colin Powell, why do we have this? There are other entities that have been created over time. State is bloated in many respects compared to when Dean Acheson was Secretary of State, for example, or George Marshall. So there are things that could be shed that would help states' efficiency and effectiveness. But I got to see the plan. And that, as always with Trump, there's no plan. There's just chaos. There's just hectic behavior, chaos. So I got to see it before I can say anything's being done well or poorly.
Yeah, I guess this is also what I was a bit curious what's happening because it's not just US AID, but it's also seeing that the National Endowment for Democracy is being defunded, and I'm curious because these are yeah, some of the regime change instruments as well. So I'm curious,
Yes.
is this about reforming the way the U.S. engages with the world on some, or is it concerns about the ideological leanings towards this grouping, or is it just about saving money? Because I think people often read into it what they want. Some people hoping for this is reducing the empire. Others simply want it to be less woke, and others think it's just about saving those money. So I was curious if you had some thought about what you think his ambitions are. I know we don't have a window into his brain, but yeah, how do you see this?
I don't think Trump has a clue what he's doing. I think that's just a fair statement to make. He doesn't know or care anything about the workings in the State Department. He just likes to break things and see how they're melded back together again, and if that produces a more effective instrument, if you will. In this case, Rubio, I think, has got carte blanche, at least initially, until Trump fires him. And that carte blanche is probably to do whatever he thinks is necessary to do to the instrument of diplomacy, supposedly, to make it better. And from what I have heard of his ideas, some of them are positive, and others I don't know. I would say neutral until determined otherwise, and then some of them are detrimental. The ones he has that, for example, I think that are going to prove detrimental are the ones that he's going to refashion, mainly Western Hemisphere affairs and the Assistant Secretariat that looks after Latin America, his principal interest, and looks after such things as the Ortegas in Nicaragua and the Maduros in Venezuela and others throughout Latin America, whom Marco Rubio seems to have some sort of vendetta against, if that's not the wrong word. So I have to wait and see if some of these changes that Rubio knows what he's doing in terms of actually affecting changes and having a purpose, not like Trump, just chaos creating, are good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know. It's not been enough time yet for me to tell. From what I'm hearing from people, I would suspect that some of them are going to be changes that I would make myself and others not so. Now, let me give you one example. For a couple of years now, let me back up. When I was chief of staff, Powell turned to me and he said, "We need a Voice of America like instrument post 9/11. We need to talk to the Muslim world, to the whole world, but to the Muslim world right now, tomorrow morning, and in the terms that we would say Voice of America talked to the world about the Soviet Union. Propaganda, yes, but based on fundamental truths." I said, "Okay, fine. How much money we got? We got 400 million. Okay." The Broadcasting Board of Governors then set up Radio Sawa, SAWA, and TV Al Hura, the truth. Um, they were supposed to gain something between 10 to 12% of audience share within the first year from BBC, from Al Arabiya, and from Al Jazeera. I thought that was preposterous. If we got 2%, we'd be lucky. And we started out and, well, we achieved 2 to 3% pretty early. All to say, about 3 years ago, one of the producers for Al Hura began contacting me and asking me to appear on television for them, out of their main studio or over Zoom. And we had Lebanese interviewers, we had Egyptian interviewers, in country interviewers. Usually they had to translate because I don't speak Arabic or Farsi. I don't think I'll ever get a call again. I will probably never get a call again because the producer was risking her own job to a certain extent with the Biden administration because I spoke what I thought was the truth in Beirut, in Cairo, in Damascus, and elsewhere. I spoke what I thought was the truth. I was interested to see that I was welcomed by the various people who interviewed me, who would have a shocked look on their face when I would say things like the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a terrible mistake. They would interview me in a more profound way when they understood what I was saying and how I was saying it. So I think now, I don't think I'll ever get another call. And I think that's a change for the negative because I was at least, and there were several others doing the same thing, former ambassadors, for example. We were putting an element of the truth that we thought the region needed about U.S. policy into these broadcasts. I think that's off now. So I think it'll be pure propaganda and it'll be Trump guided propaganda, Elon Musk guided propaganda, whoever the hell has the broadcasting board of governors under its thumb.
You mentioned Trump likes to, yeah, break things he don't like or maybe don't understand, and see if he can put it back together in a better way. And it can't help but to make me think of well, a lot of the foreign policy issues we're dealing with, or wars. For example, the Middle East. It seems to be an approach he usually has. He comes in with big blusters and make a big splash in order to break the status quo. And yeah, with this subsequent movement, he will have some room for maneuver to change things. So he comes in, he threatens to ethnically cleanse every Palestinian from Gaza, and then, of course, buy it. Then I think he realizes who they actually buy it from. And how would this work? And then he says, "Oh, never mind. I'll just take it." So it's yeah, some of this it seems impulsive, I guess. It has some indications to it, but also I would like to think there's a bigger plan behind this, something he wants to achieve. I think that the disadvantage of making such a big splash is obviously that the entire region begins to shift in a way that he might not like. Assuming that the wider region is not that yeah, positive about the idea of America ethnically cleansing Gaza and shipping their population um, to their country before recolonizing it, or colonizing it. So, how do you see what's Trump's approach to Israel? Because he's a lot of people voted for him because he was going to end the wars.
I think he's doing typical Trump. I go back to his earlier term in office when he shocked the world with his opening to Kim Jong Un and then had no follow up whatsoever and probably did as much to spoil a very viable alliance with South Korea as any president since Jimmy Carter and his overture to withdraw American forces from the peninsula. Uh, what did he do there, though? I mean, let's just parse it for a moment. There's no way that the United States of America can affect the removal of what is probably less than the 2.3 million we started with. I suspect 2 or 300,000 less. So let's say 1.9 million Palestinians from Gaza. There's no way he can affect the removal of those people. No matter how he tries to do it, there's no way. And Bibi is going to end this first period of the ceasefire and commence again his way of doing it, which is killing everything in sight. The Palestinians are simply not going to leave. And Bibi's going to find, and the IDF is going to discover, because the reason Bibi actually agreed to this ceasefire, phase one, was to refit and rest the IDF, who were being roundly defeated by both Hezbollah on one flank and Hamas on the other. That defeat will continue. And when I say defeat, it's a failure to accomplish your strategic objective, clearly expressed by you, Mr. Prime Minister, as eliminating Hamas. You have done no such thing. And no Palestinian in Gaza is ready to leave that I know of. In fact, the exact opposite, while Bibi resumes killing everything in sight. So, how do you get these people out? And the idea that General Al Sisi in Egypt, or the king in Jordan would do what Trump wanted them to do and embarrass the king of Jordan majorly in the Oval. I think it was in the Oval. So much so that he had to go outside and recant apparently what he had in silence seemed to acquiesce to in the office with Trump is preposterous. The situation of Egypt now is so precarious they can't feed or water their own people. They have real problems feeding and getting water to clean water, potable water to their own people. They have no space for any more people. nor does the king of Jordan, who is sitting on a powder keg already. You give him another, say, half of that million Palestinians, and the Bedouin rulers are gone along with him. They're gone. And you're talking about even wider spread chaos in that region. These are all untenable things that Trump is talking about. So in this case, his strategy of breaking a lot of China and then seeing who picks up the pieces, and if any of the pieces can be molded back together in a better fashion than previously, has failed miserably. And Netanyahu, first shocked by it, is now taking advantage of it and is going to resume the killing as soon as the hostages on Saturday are brought back. That's my prediction anyway. So this is a disaster that and let's look at how this went off with the meeting. Here they are, but Netanyahu and Trump talking about, and Trump in particular talking about, literally the tragedy of Gaza and how horrible it is, the ruins, the damage, and both of them are responsible. Both of them are morally and reprehensibly morally responsible for everything that's happened there. And yet they're talking about it as if it just was arrived from space, this problem with the Palestinians. So we'll ship them to Alaska, or we'll ship them to Saudi Arabia, or to Egypt and Jordan, or we'll come in and build them a beautiful home and then invite them back. This is preposterous. And it didn't help at all. It deepened the problems. We even have Lebanon now. The government of Lebanon, which is favorable towards us, is talking about the problems they're having with Israel in serious ways right now. Israel has not honored a single day of either the ceasefire with Lebanon or the one with Gaza. It is kill people in both theaters every day of the ceasefire. So that's the Israeli version of a ceasefire. And now they want to extend the one in Lebanon because they can't get the people to come back to their homes in the north. And they think if they extend it out to the end of February, maybe even into March, they'll get the people to come back and it won't be so embarrassing for them. I got news for them. They're probably not going to come back even in that event. So we have a catastrophe building still in Gaza. And Trump has done nothing to arrest the progress of that catastrophe.
Yeah, there was something quite absurd about watching Netanyahu and Trump sitting together, uh, yeah, expressing concern about all the horrors and destruction after, of course, this duo inflicted this damage. And then, of course, moving on to the humanitarian solution, which is, let's just remove them all. This ethnic cleansing as this humanitarian solution. It's it's very yeah, it's very bewildering. But I guess for the rest of the region, this alienates the US, I would think, to a large extent, because especially when he said that he's spoken to leaders around the region and they all think it's a great idea. This, if you're on the streets of Turkey, Jordan, or even Saudi Arabia, certainly this does not go down well. But sorry, but
Let me just add to what you just said, with which I agree. If you look, and I had a meeting 2 nights ago with some fellow military professionals, and we sat down with maps and looked at things. We looked at disposition of forces, we looked at fighting contingents, potential terrorists, and so forth. If you look at it through a purely military lens, Israel is embattled badly in the longest war it's ever engaged in. It is not a force for a long war. It has reservists that are really reluctant, if not failing to heed the call to be called up. It has its entire economy wrecked because of all these people gone from the economy. The reserve is 400,000 of them. And you look at the array of Turkish troops in Syria and how far Israel has gone now into Syria, well beyond the Golan Heights portion that belonged to Syria in the first place, and their own part, according to them, well beyond that into Syria proper, and Damascus having no means to do anything about it, apparently. And you look at El Sisi's capabilities, and you look at the capabilities of Jordan, particularly their armored forces, which are quite good, small, but quite good. And you look at what could come out of Lebanon in terms of the remnants of Hezbollah, and you think about what all of those forces in some sort of unity could do to the IDF now, eliminate it within 2 months, eliminate it. And then what would happen? Would they go to the Solomon option, as Golda Meir suggested, I think in 1972, 73? Would they use a nuclear weapon on themselves even? Because at that point, they would have to use it on themselves because everyone would be investing Israel, or use it on Cairo or use it on Amman or whatever. Anything like that would be. And let's say Turkey joined too. Turkey has forces up there in the northern part of Syria. This is just a military look at everything. And we said, wow, if you wanted to get rid of Israel and you had a really visceral idea of Israel and you were tired of what Israel has done now for 70 plus years in the region, largely as the U.S. instrument to do it, maybe you would move. And would you move in concert? Hell yes, you would. Would Mossad detect it and act rapidly in advance of it to staunch it? How could they staunch it? They're tied down in Gaza and to a certain extent still in Lebanon. So stay tuned. Stay tuned.
This is what I mean, that often, one reads only the minor issues happening on the battlefield, such as you mentioned, being tied down in Gaza and in Lebanon. But the wider ramifications are so important. And indeed, a lot of the Israelis who left Israel, as I said, it's becoming an economic drain and a huge problem, something that might actually be what brings down Israel. But at the same time, you have the wider development, which is the relative decline of the United States with other great powers entering the stage. You have the alienation of Israel's key allies, not just Europe, but also if you look at civil society, public opinion in the United States. Uh, yeah, as I said, Jordan could easily be destabilized from this. The Turkey has a population which is enraged. Egypt is a bit of a wild card. We just had a recent regime change in Syria. I'm not sure how much political stability we want to bet on an Al Qaeda leader taking over. And yeah, just from across the board, it seems that there's making these big splashes right now. It's going to be very unpredictable in the time to come. Is is this really the main strategy going ahead? Because also this idea now of even going after Iran, it's as some someone from the military. How would you how would you how would you plan this? Having some realistic expectations going forward. How is this going to play out? Because this is
That's the question of the hour, and I don't think the Trump administration is well equipped to answer that question, and certainly the president isn't. His knowledge of the region and his knowledge of the players in the region is strictly what people use the term transactional, but I use the term money. It's strictly based on MBS has a lot of money, and there's a lot of things we could do there to make Jared Kushner a lot of money and me a lot of money. That's kind of the way he looks at it, I think, and that's absolutely the wrong way to be looking at it right now, in my view. You've got a situation. Let's say what I was just talking about. You've got a situation where would the United States, if Israel were in existential peril from a coalition of forces that suddenly got really angry and decided to act in concert, intervene? No, in my mind, they would not. We would not put, even with Trump there, or I should say with Trump there, we would not put troops on the ground. Might we take air power and try to, do something to the armored columns that would undoubtedly be exposed in something like this? We might, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what would happen. We might just let Israel fend for itself in those circumstances. The pressure would be pretty great, I think, but not quite as great as it would have been a year ago or 2 years ago, because the public opinion in the United States is shifting. It's probably above 56, 57% right now that don't agree with what's happening in the Levant and don't agree with the United States policy with respect to Israel in some way or another. And this tragedy in Gaza is what has lit this fire, lit the burning of the fuse that's saying Your charges of anti-Semitism, no matter you put them into law, Congress, you put them into the courts, Supreme Court, you make them really heinous against Americans and violate the Constitution in the process, isn't going to work because Americans are not going to be cowed into, your idea of what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. And this is not anti-Semitism that's developing for the large part. I'd say 97, 98% of it is just disgust with this little attack dog in the Levant that keeps doing what it's doing and is going to resume it again, I think. So you're losing the American people with regard to Israel for the first time in 78, 79 years. That's a real turning point, I think. The second thing I would comment on, though, with regard to what you said, is that you're looking at a president who absolutely does not want to go to war with Iran. And that is Bibi's biggest ask of him. And it is Bibi's intent to use everything that he has within his power in the next few weeks, in particular, to change Trump's mind and to get him to go after Iran. I don't think he's going to change Trump's mind. And I say that for two reasons. Trump seems to have a visceral instinct of how, and I know the Pentagon fed him this in his first term. And I mean, I don't use fed unguardedly. They gave it to him, all chapter and verse of how disastrous a war with Iran would be, especially if you had to go on the ground. So I think he's imbued with that, but he's also got his own instincts over the years, and they've developed to be anti-war with Iran. Don't ask me why. Maybe he's smarter than I think he is. I'm deadly anti-war with Iran. So what's he doing right now? I think he's using the good offices of Oman to explore with Javad Zarif, the vice president of Iran, and others who are willing to do this, opening new talks. And Trump is aiming at a very transactional matter. He wants to have a better deal than Obama and Biden. He wants to have a deal that will be the TJPCOA or whatever, the Trump plan. And Javad Zarif in Davos, the vice president of Iran, actually said things, very good in English. He actually said things that would lead me to believe that the Iranians might even be open to no moratorium, no time that this agreement would elapse, as was the case with the original JCPOA. Also, he entertained the idea of other matters like ballistic missiles and so forth could be in the discussions. That was verboten with the JCPOA negotiations. So what if Trump is headed for a deal with Iran that would ensure that they don't get a nuclear weapon? Iran right now is probably 2 weeks. They're 60% enriched, and the distance between 60% and the 90+% for a weapon is about 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, they could have 4 to 5 nuclear weapons. What would Israel do? Would they go without the United States after those weapons, after the complex that was producing them? I don't know. Probably if Mossad gave them irrefutable evidence that the Iranians had in fact said 2 weeks from now we're going to have a bomb. But then that's asking Mossad to do something I think that might be impossible right now, given what they've done in the past and Iran's attempts and probably successful to prohibit it happening again. But that's a very dangerous situation. Trump could take that danger away. And I think the Iranians would be serious in their negotiations. They've got some Trump cards too. You may have heard the AN-24s landed in Iran and offloaded Su-35E super flankers. These are really good aircraft, every bit the equivalent of anything Israel has, including the F-35. I think they're superior. They're equipped with R-37s, I think. These are very good aircraft. They put the first squadron on the ground already. The new equipment training team will be working. It takes about 6 months, but if they put subsequent squadrons there and continue to do this, if Russia continues to give Iran these first line fighters, then Iran is not in the position that you might have said it was when Syria collapsed and it was essentially kicked out. So the whole situation is changing, and that would be a good move by Trump, I think. And it would be absolutely horrendous for Bibi. I mean, Bibi's whole purpose in life is to get the United States to help him take out Iran's nuclear capacity at a minimum, and maybe even take out Iran as a state that opposes Israel. And this would just ruin that. So, I mean, there are all kinds of things happening in the background, perhaps, that Trump has set in motion. And we just have to wait and see if any of them are, unlike his North Korea gambit in his first term, successful.
Yeah. Well, this seems to be the trend in his negotiation as well. This to offer either a good deal or the alternative will be, yeah, he will unleash his fury upon them. And this is
Right.
something he said during his first administration as well. The good thing about John Bolton, even though he called him horrible, was he brought his dog with him, and this was, either make a deal with me or I send my dogs on you. And I'm wondering if Netanyahu is the dog in this situation, in which he goes to Iran and other countries, and we'll let this beast on you unless you make a deal with me, and then I can control him. Again, I'm not sure, but that does take me to uh, my other question, though, more close to home here, which is the war we have in Europe, that is the proxy war in Ukraine. Because here as well, Trump started off with first he was going to end the war in 24 hours, and then he extended it a bit. When he finally took office, he had some very strange messages coming out. He seemed to be very misinformed about the situation in Russia. He thought they had 1 million dead, which makes no sense at all. He suggested their economy was in the toilet. He insulted them a little bit about the World War II history in terms of the Soviets having helped America a little, as opposed to they being the main fighting force defeating the Nazis. So, but after this, he now made a call. They spoke, and suddenly things looks very, very different. Not just what Trump said, that we should get along, our great countries should cooperate, and at the same time we have Hegseth who came out and made this comment, which really, at least in Europe, shook the continent because yeah, he says they will, the peace agreement, he will have to recognize that there won't be any NATO expansion. Ukraine will not get its territories back, and also there will be no security guarantees from the United States. And just as an icing on the cake, by the way, European security will not be a priority anymore. We will, probably hinting that the US is heading more to Asia. This is what are we to read of all of this? This is quite yeah, huge splash, if you want to use this term. This is a massive, massive shift. At least the Europeans are very uncertain now what to do.
Actually, I watched Jens Stoltenberg talking rather aggressively and almost apoplectically about how the Europeans are meeting their goals. We're already at 2% and we're going to go above 2%. We're doing what we need to do. We're doing as much as Jens Stoltenberg can get out of his character and be apoplectic. He seemed to be so. And this was right after Hegseth had made his remarks. I agree with you that this was probably a bombshell for particularly French, German, and other ears in NATO. I'm not sure that I trust them. I'm not sure I trust Trump. I'm not sure I trust the reports on his supposed conversation, I think, from Air Force One with Vladimir Putin. But if he's going to live up to what he promised before he was elected, reaffirmed right before the inauguration, and then seemed to be embarked on post inauguration, and has deviated from majorly, which is typical Trump. Mercurial as hell. You never know where he's going. But if he is going to move, this is the time to do it. And Hegseth setting up that the way he did makes me think that perhaps they are going to at least start trying to do it. It's going to be difficult for Trump because I think Putin has made it very clear what the parameters of a deal, so to speak, would be for him. And there's not a lot of wiggle room in those parameters for Trump to find a moment of grandiose bragging that he got a great deal. What he's going to do is affirm essentially what Putin wants affirmed. And I'm not sure that that's going to look like a great deal when he comes back, as it were, and reports to the American people on it. But he's a great man for making a pig in a poke look like it's got a silk purse. So I can only say I'm for this. Let's get it stopped. Let's get it stopped quickly. I listened to Mearsheimer on a British John Mearsheimer on a British show this morning while I was working out, and John says essentially, no, this is all just look at the things Trump has said negative about Russia, which you were going through some of. Look at all the insults he's hurled towards Putin. Look at his 1 million casualties. That's preposterous. Russia hasn't taken 1 million casualties. Russia's economy is on the tanks. They had 3.9% growth going right now. They're looking pretty good. Um, and Mearsheimer was saying this isn't going to end anytime soon. There's no way Trump is going to end this because he's not going to be able to make a deal with Putin. I'm not so sure I agree with the sort of cold hardness of John, uh, but John's probably onto something with regard to Trump's ability to continue meaningful negotiations on any matter and to come to a success that is largely achieved by him. He proved that in his first term. So I don't know what to say other than I want this stopped. Trump said he would stop it, so get to it and stop it.
Yeah, I must say I agreed. I've agreed to a large extent with John's pessimism about the ability to reach a peace agreement. Also thinking that this would likely be resolved on the battlefield as the Ukrainian army collapses. Simply because what the Russians are asking is a very big ask. It's to yeah for NATO to sever itself completely. So no everything they promised for the years now that triggered the war. So no NATO and not even security guarantees. The guarantees after everything Ukraine has gone through and of course having to accept the loss of territory. So it's a very big ask. But suddenly it appears that. Well, he's willing to offer this, but at least according to Hegseth. But of course, there could be some negotiations around this thing, whether or not the Ukrainians would accept that the territories have been lost, or just we agree to disagree. But and the Europeans, I'm a bit uncertain about, and this is something also I thought about because. What do you think the role will be for the Europeans and the Ukrainians in these negotiations? Because Trump was also asked about this. Should not Ukraine have a central role in negotiations? And he said, well, he effectively didn't answer it. And I got also the impression that for both the Americans as well as for the Russians, they see this as the Europeans and Zelensky, that their demands are just unrealistic, and they both seem interested in keeping the war going. So. And also, it's not really that relevant anymore. I guess the United
Well,
States
yeah,
controls Zelensky
Zelensky,
and Europeans. So.
I think Putin is right. You may call it a negotiating tactic, but I nonetheless think he's right. And I think Trump would accept this. Zelensky's illegitimate. He's not the legitimate leader of Ukraine. So on that argument alone, you discard Zelensky, and if Ukraine wants to participate in any subsequent talks, you say, okay, elect someone, and let's have that person go with me or whatever. Um, I would go after it in a much bigger way, though. Again, the other night we talked to military professionals, and I talked about this. I would go after it in the way that we were going to go after it under Powell as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1992 and 93 until Clinton mucked it up. And then, as we were again talking about it at the State Department when Powell became chairman or became Secretary of State, and I think about that sometimes, that was 25 years ago. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, it's still a valid concept, and that is put Ukraine aside, except as a instrument toward a new European security architecture. I think Putin would go along with that as long as you said, Mr. Putin, we want you and your 148 million European Russians to be a part of this architecture, as we did in 1992, and then we screwed it up. Let's have a new security architecture. Take your CSTO and eventually toss it to the wind. We'll take our NATO and toss it to the wind. And let's come up with a new architecture that includes you as you should be in Europe. If it takes 10 years to do this, so be it. But let's get started on it. And then you could include in that a lot of other things that we need to do also, which is new nuclear weapons treaties, particularly between the major owners, Moscow and Washington, and perhaps even later bring others in. Russia could bring, for example, North Korea in, and we could bring that little bastard state at the end of the Mediterranean, Israel, in, if they still exist. But I know this is grandiose and it sounds outlandish, but we were so close to something like this being started until Clinton came in and mucked it all up, and Yeltsin helped a lot too, that it makes me think that it's not an impossibility if you had some interested people orchestrating the diplomacy associated with it. Now, it'd mean you'd have to have someone follow Trump if Trump leaves. You'd have to have someone who agreed with this and could continue the policy. One of the problems we've had in Washington is administrations disagreeing with one another. And, during the Cold War, we had all this argument politically, but we never differed much. We all stayed on the same national security strategy and policy. Not since. We've been all over the map, and Trump has taken us on a new map even. But I think that would be a thing to shoot for, and to make that the target as well as the interim target of ceasing the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I think that would be an excellent approach, actually. First of all, by creating a new European security architecture, it would actually be a way to pursue a positive sum approach to ending the war, something which will elevate security of all. And I also think if we recognize that the war in Ukraine is the result of a collapsing European security architecture, because it has to be pointed out that, as you said, in the early 90s, there were close. There were agreements for indivisible security. Even an institutions was set up with the OSCE, which was intended to be inclusive, based on a Europe without dividing lines, indivisible security. So we're heading in that direction. But I think the objective of having a security system based on unipolarity, that is global primacy, it kind of threw that under the bus, because the whole premise of the Europe we were talking about was one where we seek to mitigate the competing, the security competition and harmonize interest. But the premise of a unipolar system is one where one side dominates to the extent that, who cares what the Russians think? Who cares if they feel vulnerable? It's one side that dominates. Now, obviously, in Ukraine, I think this all fell apart. So it would kind of make sense to address this, especially if NATO expansion was this manifestation of this unipolar objective. But is this possible to achieve immediately after a war? I mean, the animosity is so immense now, not just on the European side, but the Russians, they're fuming a bit as well. They see this. I think they're willing to forgive the Americans, but the Europeans, I think it's a different matter. They are quite upset.
And you've got to deal with the visceral hatred amongst some people in America of Russia, inherited from the British, and to a certain extent in Germany and France and other places, less so in France, I think. But you got to get beyond that, I think. And your point about there being a war and that screwing things up takes me back to 1945 when Dean Acheson was trying to get Harry Truman very interested in NATO, and wound up using the Korean War to have Harry go from $8 billion to $52 billion overnight, and shifted most of that money not to the war in Korea, but to NATO and the formation of the alliance that would keep Europe at peace for a long time during the Cold War. That motivation is not quite as powerful today. Ukraine is simply not the theater that we had with regard to World War II and then possible nuclear war. but it still is an impetus, I think. And if you had imaginative, that's what our politicians on both sides of the Atlantic lack today is imagination and a drive and energy to put that imagination into effect. We haven't had that for a very long time. Someone asked me the other day, why do you think we have such sorry leaders in America? Since George W. Bush, really, we've had sorry leaders. I said, well, you produce what you can. And that's what our system and to a certain extent our Constitution and our people have produced 340 million people, and we can't find anybody but bums to put into Congress and to put into the White House. That's what we've been doing. And now we have a whole collection of motley crew from Elon Musk to Peter Thiel. We have people who are talking about giving white people in South Africa power again. We have people talking about doing all sorts of absurd things domestically, like eliminating women from the armed forces of the United States when they comprise 27% of the armed forces. And we wouldn't have an army if we didn't have women. It's crazy. We have no leadership and we have no imagination. And that's a critical shortcoming right now at this particular point in history, I think, because as you're probably aware, my theory is it's going back. All the power in the world, economic, intelligence, informational, financial, military, all the power in the world, which was in the East for 2 millennia and then migrated to the West, culminating in the American Empire, is now slowly but surely inexorably going back to the East, with the magnet pulling it being China. And we're fighting that tooth and nail. That's what this theory of global hegemony and all domain dominance, all these things we talk about. That's what it's all about. That's why we have to gin up hatred for Russia. Ultimately, we'll gin up hatred for China. And all of this is happening. And Mearsheimer says, of course, it's inevitable. We need to establish a containment policy for China. We need to get out of Ukraine, get out of the focus on Gaza, and establish a containment policy for China. Well, why do we have to establish, John, a containment policy? Why can't we have imagination and a new policy? Why can't we have a policy of condominium, if you will, a policy that China has vouchsafed a number of times, calling it the ASEAN community policy? You know, where we were after ASEAN while Powell was chairman and then when he was Secretary of State to have a security dimension, and they kept telling us, no, we're not interested in having a security alliance. We're interested in commerce and trade and good relations. Oh, by the way, peace does that best. When's the last time China was at war? When's the last time China sanctioned anybody? When's the last time any country out there, which now constitutes 3/5 of the world's population, 1 in 5 is Chinese, 1 in 5 is Indian, and 3 in 5 are Asian. So 60% of the world's population lives in Asia. That's where the power's going. Don't fight it, accommodate it, work with it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, often if states aren't behaving as the theory would suggest, usually, you want to go back at the drawing board looking at the theory. And what's interesting with China now, irrespective of all these threats, and let's get the Chinese, contain them, you would think that counter alliances would form, but China is still very adamant. It doesn't want to get involved in military alliances. It has options. It could ally with the Russians. It could form other alliances, but it sees this as being a very destructive approach, which incentivizes counter alliances. So yeah, for many reasons, they don't want anything to do with this. So it is this lack of imagination. You might be onto something. This is also something Kennan referred to back in the 90s when he said, when we finally ended the Cold War, why are we talking about expanding military blocks? And is this how narrow we can conceptualize what security means to build blocks? I mean, this is, it's absurd. We should be able to think beyond this. But on the topic of lack of imagination, Europe is definitely there. You mentioned Jens Stoltenberg, pleading with Trump, look, we're doing our 5%. Yeah, he's the former prime minister of this country, also of Norway. And as the US is seen to, be in relative decline and shifting its strategic focus to the east, Instead of adjusting to this multipolar world, perhaps seeking to take advantage of this rise in the east of by connecting, for example, the Eurasian continent. The main some idea appears to be let's increase our own market value for the Americans so they won't leave us. So the Norwegians are now opening, yeah, American military bases. They seem to be comfortable with making the Arctic front line against the Russians, which would make us the Ukraine of the North as it was, and even across Europe, as the economies are going, yeah, very south, they're still willing to increase their the military budget. So, the, do you see any any if well this doesn't seem to have a lot of future, but do you see NATO possibly falling apart as a result of this, or how do you see the yeah? Because obviously, even now that if the America doesn't really want to prioritize Europe anymore, anyways, what are the Europeans going to do? This is there seems to be a very disoriented continent with its, yeah, economic decline, growing irrelevance, divisions within, and most of all, I guess, a lack of political imagination. But do you see realistically NATO falling apart in the, yeah, foreseeable future?
I do, and I've said that many times over the last several years that I don't think NATO has a future. And I lament the fact that you were describing, partially at least, there's no imagination and no willingness in Europe to face this reality and deal with it. Instead, we have, as you said, Europe joining the United States in this, and you brought it up, I'll comment on it, this incredible thing I see in my own country where Arctic Council be damned. The Russians are going there, so we're going there, and we're going to fight eventually. And my God, we're going to operationalize everything we possibly can in the Navy and the Coast Guard, and Canada's going to be with us, and we're going to take the Russians on in the Arctic. I hear this every day on webinars from the Naval War College and elsewhere where they're talking about this sort of militarization of the Arctic. And I ask myself, when is the Antarctic going to come into this too? Because it's larger landmass than most other continents. But we're weaponizing or militarizing everything we possibly can. Why is Trump talking about Greenland? Why is he talking about the Panama Canal? Really, because people are telling him that these are things that we should never have surrendered or that we should own. We had a recent webinar from the Naval War College, again, my old stomping ground where I was a professor for a while and where I went to school. We had a recent one on critical minerals. And all the, these names are just indecipherable almost. You look at all the minerals that are critical that are people are killing people like Leopold killed people in Central Africa right now for these minerals. And we're going to do it in any way we fashion or form we can across the globe with sanctions, with pressure, whatever, trying to get these minerals. Two of them that are absolutely critical are 95% in the hands of the Chinese already. I have to imagine that Trump hadn't gotten that briefing yet. But Deng Xiaoping not only set out to get rare earth metals, 95%, I think China finally cornered the market on rare earth metals, but that prompted Australia, us even, and others who have rare earth metals to finally revitalize our mining industry because we saw what was happening. But these are more difficult minerals, if you will, to get your hands on in terms of quantities and throughput in your supply chain. And many of them affect critically American military instruments as well as civilian cell phones and things like that. So we're ginning up right now to have these colossal conflicts over these critical minerals. And Trump just mouthing off about those in Ukraine was just an indicator of this. Instead of talking about how we deal with supply chain and supply lines in a global economy and get these critical minerals where they need to get to whomever it needs to get to. I go back to 2009 when we conducted a simulation in Beijing in the financial district in the new Ritz-Carlton that had just been completed there. They let us have the 2 floors in the hotel. Microsoft set up the computers. Deloitte Touche gave all the money that we needed to do this. And we disrupted in this simulation with Chinese there. Lloyd's of London was there. All the MARAD people were there, shippers were there, others, and we disrupted the oil flow across for 3 days across the globe and then dealt with it. We did it by terrorist attacks in the Strait of Malacca. We did it by terrorist attacks on Ras Tanura and Saudi Arabia and so forth. And then we reacted to that. And at the end of that game, we were all stunned. I think the U.S. personnel, most of all, maybe the Chinese too, we were stunned by what we were able to do. We were able to, in a simulated environment with all these players, we were able to shift oil supplies in very dramatic ways all across the face of the globe so everyone survived. So everyone's economy was not hurt badly. At one point, oil went to $300 a barrel. Shippers wouldn't ship, refiners wouldn't continue refining. We had a real problem. We got that oil back down to a reasonable price for WTI and Brent crude almost within a week by simply cooperating and shifting supply flows all across the globe. Why can't we do that now? Why can't we do that in reality? Well, we can't because we have leaders who don't want to. And much of it is because too much money is flowing from the disharmony. Too much money is flowing from Ukraine into Lockheed Martin's bank accounts. Too much money is flowing from all this animosity into people's bank accounts. That's one of the biggest impediments to our having a better world and a more peaceful world and a less filled with war world. I don't know how you get a handle on that because all these accounts are already set up and functioning and they're making tons of money off of it. People amaze me when they talk about all the tax money being spent on Ukraine. Do you know where most of that money came and went? It went to Lockheed Martin. It went to Grumman. It went to Bechtel. It went to all these people who are making the implements of war that are going to Ukraine. We got to stop that chain and build a more benign chain. And critical minerals represent to me a perfect example of where to start. There are enough of these critical minerals for 100 years for current use for everyone that needs them in the world. So why corner the market? Now, we do need to do something about these gangs. They're essentially gangs in Central Africa and elsewhere who are using these minerals to make a fortune to continue their gangs and to continue the killing and so forth. But that could be done by a joint task force. Put a joint task force together, like we were going to do in Haiti, for example. The Chinese were actually going to volunteer forces for that joint task force. We did put a combined joint task force in the Red Sea to stop the Somali pirates. Don't ask me why. We have no imagination. We don't see a new world. We don't see a new way of running that world, of orchestrating that world. It doesn't pay heed to the past, doesn't take those old hatreds and just make them deeper and more profound and cause wars and maybe lead to a nuclear war. We just seem bound and determined to destroy ourselves.
Yeah, so I just have one last question on the issue of the corruption of money, as you brought it up. To what extent, being on the inside of the State Department, is this influence of the military contractors, Lockheed Martins, and the rest? To what extent do they, if not dictate or influence the foreign policy in terms of just the formation of policy and how it's carried out? Uh, how would you describe it, or is it as bad as people think, I guess?
People always talk about AIPAC. John and Steve Walt and John Mearsheimer wrote the book on the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby. Very, very careful to make that distinction.
Yes.
And I think the more powerful lobby is actually the military industrial complex. They own our Congress. They certainly own the Senate Armed Services Committee, and they own the House Armed Services Committee, and the subcommittees like the one McConnell just moved to. People ask me, why did Mitch McConnell want to go to that little subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee, the SAC being one of the most powerful committees in the Senate, if not the most powerful, because it distributes the money. Well, McConnell's no fool. He was in the Senate for a long time. He knows the Senate. He moved down to the subcommittee of the SAC that deals with that money flowing to military contractors. That is the best place for McConnell to be. He could steal billions for Kentucky and billions for himself and his cronies. Guaranteed that's why he moved there. That's what our Congress is today. It's a wholly owned subsidiary, not of APAC, but of the military industrial complex. And you got to break that. You got to break that. If you want Hegseth to do something, Donald, really significant, break that link. I don't know how you do it, though, because almost all the Congress, with very little exception, is bought and paid for.
Well, perhaps as Trump and Elon Musk, for some reason, takes a sledgehammer to the bureaucracy, perhaps they will actually go in and yeah, begin to address some of these issues as well. At least we could hope.
Elon and his partner, Peter Thiel, and J.D. Vance seem to be trying. They recognize this, and they seem to be trying not to stop it, but to shift the flow into tech. It's, high tech. They want AI and that sort of thing to get all the money. Well, that's obvious why. I mean, they own the companies.
So this is the battle of the oligarchs, the
Yeah,
IT
exactly.
versus the weapons industry.
Exactly.
It's the change of times. Well, Colonel Wilkerson, I really appreciate you giving your time. Thank you so much.